I'm going to reflect today on John 13. In many ways, John 13 summarizes in a congealed way the previous chapters of John, and then points the way to John 14 to 17, which is the essence, or Jesus' metaphysics, theoretically, and what it means existentially and practically. And then after John 17, you move back into the historic journey of Jesus, Romans and Sanhedrin conspiring together for his crucifixion, and then the resurrection, which bursts the church itself. So John 13 is a very, very important chapter in summarizing what has gone before, pointing the way to John 14, 17, and then after that a return to the historic phase. In many ways, the John 13 is comparable to Plato's Symposium. It's the Christian Symposium, just as Plato's Timaeus is. It can be used in a way to compare to Genesis in the Bible. What are their different understandings of the coming to be of the physical world itself? So John 13 is foundational in that sense. I'm going to entitle these reflections on John 13, Christian Cannibalism, or Allegoria Facti. Looked at Allegoria Facti before, the difference between allegory as a way of interpreting text in terms of the best element and what it speaks to people on their journey, versus Allegoria Verbi, which leads to speculations. They don't really speak to people on their journey. So, to John 13. John 13 begins, yet once again, this is the third time. Anytime you get three within biblical thought, it evokes, it calls forth, it welcomes people to the very nature of the Trinity itself. So this is the third Passover that Jesus is at. Significant that it's a third one, as I mentioned, because of the path that opens people up to the mystery of the divine itself. But Pascha, or the Passover, was also at a historic level, literal, grammatical, historic level, the story of the Jews' journey from Egypt, where they had been slaves, where they had been oppressed, where they had been under pharaonic control. So in the literal historic, this was a celebration every year at Pascha or Passover, their freedom from slavery. So you get a dualism here. Freedom, slavery, oppression, oppressed. This is again an old hermeneutic that goes back and is certainly being replayed in our time in terms of oppressor, oppressed. But the Passover then at that literal level was very much about the Jews becoming free from injustice and the journey to their promised land, the land of milk and honey. The Passover was also read allegorically both by Jewish mystical writers, Philo, Christian the whole Alexandrian tradition, Philo, Gregory of Nyssa, Christian writers, as the journey from the false self of Egypt, in which a person is encaged or in bondage to the Pharaoh of the false self, in all the multiple desires and wants and appetites that imprison a person, and then the journey from that false self of the Egypt and the ego of the Pharaoh, which dominates, and fleeing from that into the new being and the new self. That meant going to the desert, of course, where all those experiences of security and safety and predictability, they were all gone, and a person was not sure of the journey. There was uncertainty. There was no guarantee, because once one is in the desert, the life of the city, even though it can be oppressive, it also has its own positive sides as well. And so the sheer uncertainty of the faith journey in the desert, and of course the promise of the new being is not yet fulfilled. And so this place between Egypt and the promised land, as a person's transitions from one to another, is a place of immense ambiguity and uncertainty. And so the whole story of Passover at a literal level is very much a nationalist political one. At an allegorical level, it's very, very much one that can be read in terms of a person's transformation. Obviously, in the Jewish tradition, it's going to be used as a national, allegorically and personally. Within the Christian tradition, not only is the literal, but there's the typological tradition, or the Christological, and then the tropological, in which Christ is the one who leads people across the desert into their new being. Very significant in John 13 that it's a dinner, and in the dinner itself, bread is very significant. And of course, once we think of bread, we got Passover. What are they fed in the desert? It's the manna. And then we go back to John 6, which in one sense seems to be a justification for cannibalism. Jesus says people have to eat his flesh and drink his blood. Now, if read literally in that sense, that becomes sheer cannibalism. And he offended a lot of people who only thought literally. Jesus obviously is thinking allegorically, not literally. For example, Augustine, in his Christian Doctrine, Book 3, Chapter 16, makes it very clear that if this is read literally, it runs counter to certainly every moral principle in Christianity, that you don't kill. You certainly don't eat people's bodies in the name of sustaining yourself. So to read John 6, where Jesus talks about he is the bread of life, and then he goes on to the bread is his flesh and to drink his blood. Of course, this is prepares people for the Eucharist itself, once read allegorically or tropologically itself, and typologically. So the manna that Jesus, or the bread, when Jesus talks about being, he is the bread of life, that he must be eaten. That brings you right into John 13, in which the table is set. He gives them bread. You go right back to the second Passover of John 6, and you have John 2. So Jesus is positioning himself not only as the manna in the journey from Egypt through the desert, so he feeds people in the desert of uncertainty, ambiguity on the journey of life. But to read John 6 in a literal way would be a bit like Jesus saying you're to be as subtle as serpents and harmless as doves. Therefore, to be a serpent, we have to get on the ground and start wriggling all over the place. Or as doves, we have to start cooing and laying eggs and flapping our wings. To understand how Jesus is using language, it's very, very much one that is certainly not to be read literally, or one gets into the most bizarre interpretations of the faith journey. So the symposium in John 13 not only sets Passover in the context, it's interesting, the final section of John 13 is the three comes up again, because Peter essentially says, I will follow you wherever you're going. Jesus says, hold on, not until the cock crows 3 times you'll discover that, in fact, when you are challenged to follow me at a meaningful level, you'll betray me. So the beginning of John 13 and the end of John 13, the number 3 is used, which is one of the destination. It's the teleology, it's the eschatology. But on the journey, Jesus is making it clear through Peter that there'll be many betrayals, there'll be many desires to turn back to Egypt, where there's the leeks and melons of Egypt. Yes, we're in a cage, yes, we're in slavery, but better to have some basic goods than to be in the desert of uncertainty and ambiguity, where we have to live by faith. And the manna that we're fed, we never quite sure when it's coming, we're not sure how to interpret it. There is these areas of uncertainty in the desert of the journey through. So the bookends of John 13 are the number 3, but what is made explicitly clear by Peter, by Jesus' statement to Peter, is that on the journey there's going to be many betrayals. You're going to hold the ideal high, and yet many times you'll betray me. But you're going to be forgiven. Just be faithful to the journey. There are those which substantively betray, and this is in John 13. Again, at the symposium, it's Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon Iscariot. So there's various positions people can take on the journey from Egypt across the desert into their new being of transformation and deification. There's John, who sits quietly. He's the mystic beside Jesus. There's Peter, who's full of enthusiasm and energy and commitments, but when push comes to shove, he often betrays the very commitments that he makes. But in Jesus, it's fine as long as the person recognizes that this is a human temptation. Recover, get back on your feet again, and there's not a lot of condemnation of people like that, because their heart is good. Their spirit is energetic. They often say and do things which are inappropriate, but they recover quickly, unlike the more hard-hearted Judas, who decidedly betrays and walks the opposite direction. And so in this dinner, this symposium of sorts of John 13, you have on the one hand, people inevitably at a physical level have food they take to nourish the body. The question is what is the bread that people eat for meaning in life? What is the food their spirit and their soul turns for to nourish, to feed them on the human journey? And if a person can begin to name the food the soul eats, the drinks that they thirst for meaning, the symposium gradually is about be careful of turning to things which will betray, that do not nourish the soul and spirit, or selling out as Judas did in terms of the bigger goals in life. Judas thought he could short circuit Jesus in terms of aligning himself with power, and through power would bring in the kingdom. For Jesus, it was a non-violent way of dealing both with the Jews and the Romans, and offering a very different view of the kingdom of God. And then there were different reactions in John 13 itself, and this is why you have John 13, you have Jesus, you have the dinner, you have the bread. So what bread do people feed on for their soul and spirit? Judas fed on a certain type of bread, a political bread that would use power to bring in the kingdom. Peter fed on the bread of impetuosity, impulsiveness, committed to something, and yet when push came to shove, would betray the very ideals he had high. But his personality was good at core. He just had to deal with certain elements of his temperament type. And then you have John, who is more consistently deep and faithful and knew how to be still and quiet. So you have John the contemplative, who knows how to sit quietly beside Jesus in the midst of the symposium or the dinner. And this is where you get the Mary Martha. So you get the Peter John, you get the Mary Martha. It's the same as the Cain Abel dualism of the contemplative and the active temperaments. And so it comes back again to the manna. What bread is a person eating? One leads to a contemplative, deeper inner center and source. Someone can eat the bread, but it isn't properly digested in terms of inwardly digested. There are people who, on the other hand, will eat it, but they don't understand what it means at all. So you have these three figures in John 13 at the Christian symposium of sorts. The other thing to note, Jesus begins John 13 with, he knew his hour had come. There's various ways of understanding time in Greek. There's chronos, or chronological time. We all live through chronological time. 1 minute follows after another, 1 hour, 1 day, 1 week. That's chronological time. And then inevitably chronos devours its own. We are all eaten by time. And so there's the consistency of chronos. But in Greek thought, there's two other words, kairos time and horos time. We get horos from horoscope, which is not what Jesus is talking about, but horoscopes come from hora, the Greek word. Kairos time is, within chronos time, there are those moments in which people come to see their own unique vocation or charism emerging. They have moments of insight, illumination of who they are really meant to be, how they're meant to live their lives. So they're epiphananic times, they're eureka times, and so hora is also a time when you know your time has come to end a certain season of life. You know you're making a bend in the trail of life, and you no more can return to the past. The past is gone and done. Now you know the hour to move in the next step of the journey. These are kairos moments in which that which a person once was is over, and they are greeted by who they're meant to be. So often in the human journey, what is it like for us to be greeted by who we are actually going to be in the future, and then we're drawn towards that. This is what you call the eschaton, or eschatological ontology, or teleological ontology. And so where you get John lying beside Jesus, and Jesus knows that his hour is up. John knows that his hour is about to come, in which he's going to go deeper into the contemplative journey. Peter's going to have to grapple with his temperament, in which he very much embodies elements of the Egyptian erratic element, unpredictable, and yet deeper than that is Peter's faithfulness. And then you have the Judas types, who you think they are a part of your community. One thinks they're faithful, they're going to be there to the end, and yet when push comes to shove, they have deeper priorities. They are feasting on different bread. They're eating different, as it were, they're feasting on other gods, or what TSI will call strange gods. And so the Christian symposium very, very much is about that. And lastly, what Jesus does as the one who won, in terms of the bread of life, the manna of life, for the manna obviously in the Passover for the Jews is really the type of Jesus, who becomes the bread of life. So Jesus becomes the new manna. Is that what Jesus does? He washes their feet. And so in that sense, what does the true master and Lord, what's the mark of a real king, a true master and Lord? He washes people's feet, and he's a servant to all. Similar in many ways you get in Lord of the Rings, Aragorn, who is willing to serve. Even though a king, he serves the hobbits, he serves the bigger issues of the time. And so Jesus sets in place then the nature of the genuine contemplative, the one who sits quietly, who knows how to eat the true bread of life, and then when nourished is the one who is willing. And of course, the one who often in Jesus' time washed feet was the slave or the servant, the doulos, in that sense. And so within this understanding of the contemplative tradition, the person who is truly deified, who is truly being transformed, like the Master, is willing to wash people's feet. It's interesting that in Hermann Hesse's great works, particularly Journey to the East, the glass bead game, even to some degree Narcissus and Goldman, you get the notion that the true leader, sorry, in Journey to the East, Leo, the head of the League, or with Magister Ludi or Joseph Knecht, who's the head of the Castellan, is the servant of all. Knecht, just a German word for one who serves in that sense. And Hermann Hesse draws deeply in that sense from John 13 in what he's doing. His understanding of true leadership is the one who serves. And so what Jesus then does with the washing of the feet, in terms of a true leader, is one who serves. And he has said previously to that, he has loved his own. So the mark of true love, which is the end of John 13, which is the great commandment, he uses the word agape, 5 words in Greek. Agape is the one in which a person initiates washing other people's feet, initiates going out to other people to care for them, to being with them on their journey, to sitting with them in their moments of struggle and agonies and tragedies and painful things in life. And so the language of agape, unlike philia or storga or eros or other Greek words about love, this is the form of love in which Jesus takes the initiative to wash feet. So those who are the true followers, who fed on the bread, the eternal bread of life, and feasted on the Eucharist of the wine and the bread are the ones who've internalized what this means. And of course the bread and the wine as symbols themselves, using more a mythos tradition. A grape, first of all, the little seed has to die in the ground, and it's that seed breaks through, gradually out comes the vine, and then when the grapes have to be crushed, and in the crushing of the grapes there has to be fermentation. So in the human journey, if we can move from another analogy rather than the Passover analogy to the Eucharistic analogy itself, there's multiple deaths from the little self, the little seed that dies, that cracks through the skin, that produces the vineyard, which then we'll move into actually in John 14 to 17, the vine and the vineyard, which is very important. And then the bread itself, again, the skin of the little self, what Alan Watts would call the skin-encapsulated ego, that has to die, so the seed gradually breaks through through the skin. It rises to become sheaves of wheat, but they have to be beat down, and then they have to be cooked. So the nature of transformation, so the whole contemplative understanding of how transformation occurs from the false self, from the world of Egypt, of the what St. Paul would call the old Adam, into our new being, is through many, many deaths. And then the bread and the wine, of course, it comes together, the resurrected self, and in there you get not only the presence of Christ, but the true presence of our new and deified being in the whole journey, the eschaton, as we move from a small little being, a little ego being, living in a little house, as it were, which was looked at earlier in my lectures, the little stone houses we build, and the cathedral of our new being opens up, just like the cathedral of nature itself. So our new nature becomes a cathedral, or what is sometimes called the temple of our new our new being. And so John 13 very much is working on these themes of what's this look like practically for the contemplative. Well, you follow Jesus in terms of being willing to serve one and all, and then agape love is at the end of this chapter. So what's it look like as people, just as Christ initiated washing of feet, so those who truly have sat by his side are the ones who initiate going out to others, rather than retreating into their private little worlds, retreating from the fray, becoming cynical or skeptical, but in love reaching out in agape love to others, to bring the manna of eternal life into the soul, so that one and all may feast on the bread and wine itself. So John 13 in that sense brings together much that went before, and then John 14 to 17 is, as I mentioned earlier, is Jesus' metaphysic, his theological metaphysic of what this looks like in terms of transformation. And then the final chapters after 17 return to the historic events in which this worldview, this outlook, is rejected essentially by a combination of the religious elite and the Roman political powers. And it's offending their understanding of what meaningful religious life is like and meaningful political life is like. And yet out of this, though, emerges what seems to be a failure at one level, a whole new civilization, which became Western civilization itself, with its themes of multiple deaths and multiple resurrections, like the phoenix itself, that in the ashes of its death, the tears that it brings, the tears are actually medicinal. They're healing for one and all. And as people die to what they are not, and again resurrecting to who they are, they know the pain of death and resurrection, and out of that comes the tears that drop on the skin of other souls that bring them into the new and eternal and deified life.